As any construction professional knows, keeping up with regulations is an integral part of the job. Sometimes that's easier said than done, which could certainly be said of the building regulations. A set of documents originally intended to make buildings safer and more efficient has, it could be argued, become a ball and chain around every professional's neck. On average, a new building regulation appears every 4 months, and that's in addition to European directives and technical standards that are pouring out like water from a burst pipe. So, in this programme, we discuss how the building regulations should work, why they're perceived to be failing, and how the regs could be improved.
And joining us in the studio to discuss things is Peter Capelhorn from Scott Brownrigg. Peter, welcome. Many thanks for coming into the studio.
Pleasure.
So why are the building regulations perceived to be failing then?
Well, we've had a number of things that have happened in recent years. Primarily, they've got very complicated technically. We've had pressures from Europe in terms of European directives, and effectively they've lost their way as well in terms of piecemeal alterations, additions, and, if I may say so, knee-jerk reactions as well.
So what are the main areas of concern then, the main problem areas?
The main problem areas have come because the regulations were set out very simply in years past, and now practitioners find it very difficult to follow. They've got a lot of third-party documentation to keep up with. Keeping track of where you're supposed to go and how you're supposed to deal with things is very, very difficult. It's very taxing and time-consuming, and you're not even certain that you're achieving the right results at the end of the day.
Right. So, sorry.
And so that's why this criticism has developed, if you like, and that's why we end up with a situation where a great deal of people across the industry have been very upset over a number of years now, and really this has been brought to a head by recent additions and alterations to the regulations.
So essentially you're saying that people are not complying because they can't understand the regs and,
Indeed.
And they're too onerous.
Yeah, and you have a situation where both practitioners and building control officers find it very difficult to actually decide on whether something is compliant or not. But you also have a situation where, because of the complexity, because of the amount of information in play, you end up with an awful lot of people saying, well, I don't really understand, so I'm not really going to comply. And that is a worry for practitioners and for clients, of course.
Yes. You said things had come to a head. Is that because of the revision to Part L?
Primarily. We had a build-up to Part L with the release of Part P, which is about electrical safety, and that's largely seen as a piece of irrelevant regulation. But Part L was actually the straw that broke the camel's back. Fundamentally, we had a really good ethos there. Lots of people agree with energy conservation and sustainable issues as an important factor. But the way in which the regulations were brought in was very tenuous. They're a very complicated set of regulations. You have a lot of things to deal with, and there were changes made right up until 2 weeks before the regulations came into play. So no wonder people were quite upset. And even now, 18 months on from their original release, we still have a lot of problems to deal with and a lot of catching up to do, if you like. And it is still very, very difficult for, say, small practitioners and single-party companies to actually deal with things in a sensible fashion.
OK, well, let's pause there for a minute and take a look at the structure of the regulations.
The UK building regulations, let us remind ourselves, are statutory instruments that seek to ensure that the policies set out in the Building Act 1984 are carried out in the construction of buildings. There are currently 14 sections to the regs, covering topics like fire safety, electrical safety and conservation of fuel and power. Each section is accompanied by an approved document. These approved documents outline a number of ways which are deemed to satisfy the regulations. The regulations themselves are actually rather brief.
So, Peter, talk us through how the regulations have developed then into their current form.
Well, they originally started way back in the 19th century as a series of guides and local regulations. Then we come through into the bylaws that developed in the early part of the 20th century, which were then turned into model bylaws, and we had some sort of continuity then growing across the country. This was then brought forward into the original building regulations that were a national entity in 1967, and then the start of what we see today was the approved documents that came under the 1984 Building Act. Now, for the first time, what that did was give us a set of documents which basically explained in simple language what the building regulations are all about, and they're the foundation of what we see today. The important thing there was the fact that we separated the legal language from a sensible language that people could understand and use, and hence the approved documents. Having said that, we must be very careful to distinguish the fact that we have the 1984 Building Act, which is the key piece of legislation. Then you have the statutory instruments, such as the Building Regulations 2000, and underneath them there is the guidance. And people should not confuse those, and that is a common problem across the industry.
And what are the regulations trying to achieve?
Well, the initial ethos was one of safe buildings, competent buildings and reliable buildings. So in other words, people could have a degree of consistency of performance and certainty that a building wouldn't collapse or would not injure their health. Since then, we've had additions on obviously thermal and energy, on drainage, and on general matters of health and welfare, for instance, for disabled people. So the regulations have expanded away from that original core doctrine. But nonetheless, the fundamentals still we rely on today are based upon health and safety.
Right, and how should they work?
Well, that is a very long question and we haven't got time for that. But fundamentally how they should work is that each of the sections have a core regulation which is in green at the head of the approved document. The approved document is guidance, it is not the regulation. Therefore, it opens up the opportunity for innovation, and a degree of discussion can take place between the designer and the building control officer. At least that's how it should work. And therefore, we should get a degree of flexibility within all the different designs that the regulations have to deal with.
Yeah, and it is important to make this distinction that you have done, that the approved guidance aren't actually the regulations.
Absolutely, and the reason that's worth emphasising is because it happens consistently across the industry. Unfortunately, there has been a trend because of the complexity we spoke of earlier. We end up with a situation where the default standard is to use the guidance as actually the regulation, and quite a few building control officers fall into that trap and insist on it. And I think practitioners should be aware that they don't have to do that, and they should fight their corner.
So if you're going to advise somebody how to find their way around the regulations, what's the best way to use them? The
best way is to start with solid core documentation. These days we're used to having everything electronically, and in fact everything is available in an electronic medium. But I would advise everyone to have a hard copy version of all the approved documents, a hard copy version of the actual statute and of the Building Act, so you know exactly where you stand. That's core principles. And then collect the third-party documentation that you need. So that is the fundamental British standards, the fundamental guidance documents that are referred to. Make sure you have those in a separate section in your office and build up a detailed knowledge section by section.
Well, we've had a look at the regs themselves and hopefully emphasised the positive. So now let's take a look in some detail at some of the issues that are causing industry concern.
Industry concern was first crystallised back in October 2005 when Building magazine launched a campaign to reform the regs. It struck a chord with many in the construction industry who saw the regs as so bloated as to be self-defeating. Professionals complained that they couldn't keep up with the blizzard of new regulations, some of which clashed, leaving specifiers scratching their heads as to how to avoid contravention. Complexity was seen as the major complaint, and the government agreed, with Housing Minister Yvette Cooper admitting the regulations are confusing and that a more consistent approach is needed.
Well, that's quite an admission from Yvette Cooper there, isn't it? Why is it that they're confusing in this sort of way?
Well, I think that the growing body of opinion has forced its way up to the heady heights of the ministerial division. And the reason that has occurred is because there is disquiet across the whole industry. That's the point. And the core issues there are the fact that you have an enormous amount of third-party documentation, for instance, at least 40 documents for Part L alone. You have an awful lot of British standards, some of which coordinate, some of which don't coordinate with the current regulations. And you have some highly technical, complex issues, firstly in energy and secondly in acoustics, that cause everybody difficulty to understand, difficulty to get to grips with. So it causes problems on site, in compliance, it causes problems with the general functioning of the regulation. People lose the plot. It gets away from where we need to go with these regulations. So consequently, with that heavyweight opinion coming across, it's no wonder that there is concern, and hopefully things are afoot to do something about it.
Yes. I mean, you mentioned British standards there. How well do they dovetail with the regulations?
Well, you see, the British standards initially were there to support and supplement each approved document. So the approved document would give you guidance for a simple case. If you had a difficult situation or a complex building, you could refer to the British standard to take you into further detail. Unfortunately, what's happened over time is that the regulations and British standards have got out of synchronisation. So consequently, you'll find references which don't exist in the approved documents, and you'll also find British standards which have been withdrawn or they've been changed, and therefore you end up with a very difficult situation to resolve from the practitioner's point of view. So it is very much buyer beware, if you like, in terms of you need to look at carefully all the regulations and all the British standards that apply to any particular problem, and sometimes it is very difficult to actually get a clear understanding, I'm afraid.
Yes. Now, I think Part L has been the section that's been getting all the headlines of late, isn't it? What do you see as the main problems here?
Well, the main problem with Part L, as I said earlier, it is a good piece of documentation, a good piece of legislation. It's trying to get people to reduce energy, yes, but the methodology completely changed with the Part L that is now current, because we moved from a very simple elemental analysis into one that was based upon the carbon footprint of the building. And so consequently, all the analysis that was done through the regulations and developing them has got very technical. So we now have a situation where, pushed on by European legislation, you have a computer program which is designed to give a national viewpoint for every building. Now, the problem with that is that it has to be simplified. It has to be, if you like, a black box. So you put information in, you get information out for compliance. That doesn't always make sense to the practitioner. So if you like, we've taken away the intuitive way of designing a building and put it into the hands of a very much more technical approach. This, of course, causes everybody to rethink the way they put buildings together. It means that architects and M&E engineers and structural engineers have to work much closer together, much earlier in the project. Therefore, that gives a problem for clients, because they're saying, well, why do you need to do all this technical analysis early on in the project? They need to understand that we need that to ensure compliance later on in the programme. It's not a simple matter anymore, and that's what's caused great concern.
And what about complex issues like sustainability?
Sustainability is obviously at the head of everybody's agenda, but the problem with it is that it's a very wide subject. It's a very difficult subject to get to grips with. There is, of course, the Secure and Sustainable Buildings Act, which was brought into force probably, I think, 18 months ago now. And that is a key piece of legislation that the government will obviously use. There's also the Code for Sustainability, which is still a code and not actually brought in under general use, only for affordable housing. The government have actually come out with a programme for that, and along with Gordon Brown's announcement recently about zero carbon housing, there is a programme to slowly bring in that Code for Sustainability as a driver, if you like, to reduce carbon and improve sustainability. But it is still very much open to conjecture exactly how that will roll out, and therefore we hit a big subject, and there is a need for it to be developed, but we still don't see any leadership. And I'm afraid, again, we are wondering whether we're going to hit a Part L situation with that as well.
Right, OK. We haven't talked much about enforcement yet. I mean, is that working?
Enforcement, No, sadly.
Right.
That's another key
I had a
problem.
feeling you were going to say
Well,
that.
it's the other side of the coin, isn't
Yeah.
it? We've talked a lot about complexity and third-party documentation and how difficult it is for the practitioner. Well, it's equally difficult for the building control officer. It's equally difficult to decide precisely whether something is actually compliant or not. These days, they need third parties to tell them. They need thermal imaging. They need analysis on air infiltration. They need analysis of the acoustics. They need full reports from these people before they can actually determine whether something complies or not. It's a very difficult equation and not something that they were initially trained to do. So we see a lot of non-compliance and potential non-compliance, which again gives everybody great concern from whichever position they sit.
Yeah. So we've covered the major issues and the problem areas. Let's now take a look at how the regulations could be improved.
Well, following industry pressure, the government has launched plans to modernise building regulations. In March 2007, the Department for Communities and Local Government published its consultation document outlining how the system could be improved. Ideas in the paper included moving away from a piecemeal approach to building regulations review, giving a clear indication of future changes, providing greater enforcement powers for local authorities, enabling persistent offenders to be tackled, providing simple guidance that helps, and making sure building control bodies are properly funded.
So just taking that first point there, it would be easier for the industry to accommodate change if new regulations were introduced at evenly spaced intervals, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, and this is one good point on the horizon, because we know that the government have now agreed that regulations in future should be brought in 2 slots during the year, April and October. And that is a key point, actually, because it means that the whole industry can gear up around those dates. What we need to see now, though, is more notice in terms of what is actually coming in, what changes are going to be made. So there's quite a few people in the industry who are saying a regulation should be made publicly available, published, and then say 6 months of time allowed prior to it coming into force without any changes, so that people can have a clear understanding about what they're going to get into.
And would it be helpful in the future to separate out compliance method from targets?
Well, yeah, there is again a lot of debate within the industry about that. There is currently quite a large amount of self-certification, particularly with specialist industries such as electrical issues and stuff like that. It's a case of identifying precisely how we can take these things forward without them getting out of hand and too complicated. And there's a lot of work going on in that right now. So really, it's a case of watch this space, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Clear guidance. Now, that's going to help everyone, really, isn't it? What sort of things are the government thinking of?
Right. Well, we know for certain that there is a move to simplification, a move to bringing things back to where they were, and that's not a bad thing at all, so that practitioners can be very clear on what is required. A clarion call, quite often, is just tell me what you want. This comes up time and time again, and quite often people don't know what is wanted, and so that's a problem. So there is a move to simplify, to make sure that people are very clear about what the requirements are, and some are thinking that perhaps there should be a separation of the regulations from the guidance documentation, so that it ensures people understand. In other words, we take out the green heading in every approved document. We put it in a separate document, and we say those are the regulations, but here are the approved guidance documents. The model there is very much what's just been happening with the CDM regulations, where good guidance has been following the regulations and industry guidance has followed on behind that. And I'm very hopeful that we will see, when there's a change of tune here, some good industry guidance following on.
And what effect would proper funding of control bodies have in the industry, do you think?
That would be very beneficial. At the moment, there is a sore point insofar as the fees that particularly building control officers earn for local authorities appear to be siphoned off to be used by the local authority generally. They're not ring-fenced. Many would say that's very unfortunate, and that funding should be put back into the industry, training building control officers, bringing on new building control officers who understand the new technologies of the 21st century.
And A final point, what we all want to see, I suppose, in the end is greater compliance, isn't it?
Fundamentally, everybody across the industry would agree that the building regs are a good thing. They're there for a good reason, and we should see more compliance. And what we need is an industry from top to toe, from minister down to the workforce, who are going to reinforce that and work together to produce that kind of outcome.
Yeah.
And we only can have that if we have clear, simple and concise documentation.
But essentially quite optimistic for the future then.
I am quite optimistic, and I think in this business you have to be. That's the point.
Peter, many thanks for coming in and taking us through.
Thank you.
And I'm afraid that's all we have time for. But as always, we say at this point, do take a look at the study notes. Well, until next time, goodbye.